Hello, I'm Karen Stathoplos, and I'm going to be reading two stories today. The first is by James Thurber. I did my thesis on James Thurber when I was at Bates, so I particularly love him. And one of my aunts with whom I had a special connection, we used to always stay up after midnight reading to each other out loud. And this particular story ended up with two sayings that we loved in later years to just always say to each other because they just made us crack up. You'd be surprised at how many times we found to say, "Get up, Buck, your time has come," and "Quick, name some towns in New Jersey." You will see. This is James Thurber, More Alarms at Night. One of the incidents that I always think of first when I cast back over my youth is what happened the night that my father threatened to get Buck. This, as you will see, is not precisely a fair or accurate description of what actually occurred, but it is the way in which I and other members of my family invariably allude to the occasion. We were living at the time in an old house at 77 Lexington Avenue in Columbus, Ohio. In the early years of the 19th century, Columbus won out as state capital by only one vote over Lancaster, and ever since then has had the hallucination that it is being followed, a curious municipal state of mind, which affects, in some way or other, all those who live there. Columbus is a town in which almost anything is likely to happen, and in which almost everything has. My father was sleeping in the front room on the second floor next to that of my brother Roy, who was then about 16. Father was usually in bed by 9:30 and up again by 10:30 to protest bitterly against a Victrola record we three boys were in the habit of playing over and over, namely, "No News" or "What Killed the Dog," a recitation by Nat Wills. The record had been played so many times that its grooves were deeply cut, and the needle often kept revolving in the same groove. Thus, "Ate some burnt horseflesh, ate some burnt horseflesh, ate some burnt horseflesh." It was this reiteration that generally got Father out of bed. On the night in question, however, we had all gone to bed at about the same time without much fuss. Roy, as a matter of fact, had been in bed all day with a kind of mild fever. It wasn't severe enough to cause delirium, and my brother was the last person in the world to give way to delirium. Nevertheless, he had warned Father when Father went to bed that he might become delirious. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Roy, who was wakeful, decided to pretend that delirium was on him in order to have, as he later explained it, some fun. He got out of bed and, going to my father's room, shook him and said, "Buck, your time has come." My father's name was not Buck, but Charles, and nor had he ever been called Buck. He was a tall, mildly nervous, peaceable gentleman, given to quiet pleasures and eager that everything should run smoothly. He said, still drowsy, with bewilderment. "Get up, Buck," said my brother, coldly, but with a certain gleam in his eyes. My father leaped out of bed on the side away from his son, rushed from the room, locked the door behind him, and shouted us all up. We were naturally enough reluctant to believe that Roy, who was quiet and self-contained, had threatened his father with any such abracadabra as Father said he had. "You've had a bad dream," my mother said. This vexed my father. "I tell you, he called me Buck and told me my time had come," he said. We went to the door of his room, unlocked it, and tiptoed through it to Roy's room. Roy lay in his bed, breathing easily as if he were fast asleep. It was apparent at a glance that he did not have a high fever. My mother gave my father a look. "I tell you he did," whispered my father. Our presence in the room finally seemed to awaken Roy, and he was, or rather, as we found out long afterward, pretended to be, astonished and bewildered. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Nothing," said my mother. "Just your father had a nightmare." "I did not have a nightmare," said Father, slowly and firmly. He wore an old-fashioned nightgown which looked rather odd on his tall, spare figure. The situation, before we let it drop and everybody went back to bed again, became rather more complicated than ironed out, as situations in our family usually did. Roy demanded to know what had happened, and my mother told him in considerably garbled fashion what Father had told her. At this, a light dawned in Roy's eyes. "Dad's got it backward," he said. He then explained that he had heard Father get out of bed and had called to him. "I'll handle this," his father had answered. "Buck is downstairs." "Who is this Buck?" my mother demanded of Father. "I don't know any Buck, and I never said that," Father contended irritably. None of us, except Roy, of course, believed him. "You had a dream," said Mother. "People have these dreams." "I did not have a dream," Father said. He was pretty well nettled by this time, and he stood in front of a bureau mirror, brushing his hair with a pair of military brushes. It always seemed to calm Father to brush his hair. My mother declared that it was a sin and a shame for a grown man to wake up a sick boy simply because he, the grown man Father, had had a bad dream. We argued the thing for perhaps another half hour, after which Mother made Father sleep in her room. "You're all safe now, boys," she said firmly. Well, it was some 6 months after this that Father went through a similar experience with me. He was at that time sleeping in the room next to mine. I had been trying all afternoon to think of the name Perth Amboy. It seems now like a very simple name to recall, and yet on the day in question, I thought of every other town in the country, as well as such words and names and phrases as terracotta, walla walla, bill of lading, vice versa, hoity-toity, Pall Mall, Bodley Head, Schumann Hike, etc., without even coming close to Perth Amboy. I suppose terracotta was the closest I came. Long after I had gone to bed, I was struggling with the problem. I began to indulge in the wildest fancies as I lay there in the dark, such as that there was no such town, and even that there was no such state as New Jersey. I fell to repeating the word Jersey over and over again until it became idiotic and meaningless. If you have ever lain awake at night and repeated one word over and over thousands and millions and hundreds of thousands of millions of times, you know the disturbing mental state you can get into. I got to thinking that there was nobody else in the world but me and various other wild imaginings of that nature. Eventually, lying there, thinking these outlandish thoughts, I grew slightly alarmed. I began to suspect that one might lose one's mind over some such trivial mental tick as a futile search for terra firma, piggly wiggly, gorgonzola, Prester John, Arc de Triomphe, Holy Moses, Larrys, and Penates. I began to feel the imperative necessity of human contact. The silly and alarming tangle of thought and fancy had gone far enough. I might get into some sort of mental aberrancy unless I found out the name of that New Jersey town and could go to sleep. Therefore, I got out of bed and walked into the room where Father was sleeping and shook him. He mumbled. I shook him more fiercely, and he finally woke up, with a glaze of dream and apprehension in his eyes. "What's the matter?" he asked thickly. I must indeed have been rather wild of eye, and my hair, which is unruly, becomes monstrously tousled and snarled at night. "Was it?" said my father, sitting up, in readiness to spring out of bed on the far side. The thought must have been going through his mind that all his sons were crazy, or on the verge of going crazy. I see that now, but I didn't then, for I had forgotten the Buck incident and did not realize how similar my appearance must have been to Roy's the night he called Father Buck and told him his time had come. "Listen," I said, "name some towns in New Jersey, quick." It must have been around 3 a.m. Father got up, keeping the bed between him and me, and started to pull on his trousers. "Don't bother about dressing," I said. "Just name some towns in New Jersey." While he hastily pulled on his clothes, Father began to name, in a shaky voice, various New Jersey cities. I can still see him reaching for his coat without taking his eyes off of me. Newark, he said. Jersey City, Atlantic City, Elizabeth, Paterson, Passaic, Trenton, Jersey City, Trenton, Passaic. It has two names, I snapped. Elizabeth and Paterson, he said. No, I said to him irritably. This is one town with one name, but it has two words in it. Like helter-skelter. Helter-skelter, said Father, moving slowly toward the bedroom door and smiling in a faint, strained way, which I understand now, but didn't then, was meant to humor me. When he was within a few paces of the door, he fairly leaped for it and ran out into the hall, his coat-tails flying. The exit stunned me. I had no notion that he thought I had gone out of my senses. I could only believe that he'd gone out of his. I ran after him and caught him at the door of Mother's room and grabbed him in order to reason with him. I shook him a little, thinking to wake him completely. Mary, Roy, Herman, he shouted. I, too, began to shout for my brothers and my mother. My mother opened her door instantly, and there we were at 3:30 in the morning, grappling and shouting, Father partly dressed and I in pajamas. Now what? Demanded my mother grimly, pulling us apart. Look out for Jamie, said Father. He always called me Jamie when excited. My mother looked at me. What's the matter with your father? She demanded. I said, I didn't know. I said he got up suddenly and dressed and ran out of the room. Where did you think you were going? Mother asked him coolly. He looked at me. We looked at each other, breathing hard, but somewhat calmer. He was babbling about New Jersey at this infernal hour of the night, said Father. He came to my room and asked me to name some towns in New Jersey. Mother looked at me. I just asked him, I said. I was trying to think of one and couldn't sleep. You see, said Father triumphantly. Mother didn't look at him. Get to bed, both of you, she said. I don't want to hear any more out of you tonight. Dressing and tearing up and down the hall at this hour of the morning. She went back into the room and shut her door. Father and I went back to bed. Are you all right? He called to me. Are you? I asked. Well, good night, he said. Good night, I said. The second story is by Shirley Jackson, who is much more known for writing The Lottery, which Stephen Price read in an earlier reading, and also The Haunting of Hill House, which is perhaps the scariest story. Well, I have no perhaps in my mind. It is the scariest story ever written. This is not a scary story. She wrote very humorously about her family, and it's called The Play's the Thing. I came to my desk one bright Monday morning recently, planning to get right to work, and looked at the various things I had been working on, any one of which I could spend my Monday doing. There were 4 manuscripts in different stages of progress on my desk. The 4th manuscript on my desk was a one-act play for children, which I had not written voluntarily. My children and some of their friends had thought they would give a play, and they'd gone about it in the eminently practical fashion that children use for these things. First, they'd chosen their costumes. Then they decided where they would give their play and how much they would charge. And then they started looking for a play to give. They'd asked me where you went to find a nice play with big parts for everybody, and I'd sent them down to the library, whereas I was sure they would find 6 volumes of plays for children. My older daughter came back to me disconsolate. Listen to this, she said and read to me. I fear me, good husband, that our wretched hut will not again withstand the rigors of the winter wind. What's that? I said. She said, it means that their house is going to blow down, but that's the way I have to say it if we do that play. Well, why not do another play instead? I asked. Do you like this better? She asked. I am Lafayette, a French man of noble birth, and I have come to this country to aid General Washington in his battle for freedom. You know, she continued, I'd be downright ashamed to get up on a stage and talk junk like that, and the other plays are just as bad. No one could remember the lines because they don't sound right. Why don't you make up your own play? I asked her. We can't, she said, but you're a writer. Well, with half a dozen of them urging me on, I sat down that evening to sketch out a one-act play. I decided that it would be most suitable for the group who were going to act if I used a familiar fairy story. I thought of Hansel and Gretel, which is a fairy story that has always annoyed me because I strongly resent that Hansel and Gretel eat the witch's house and never get punished for it. I thought I might please myself by seeing that Hansel and Gretel got what was coming to them. So I made the witch into a fine, crazy character full of progressive ideas about the improvement of witchcraft. I put in an enchanter to accommodate an older boy in our cast, and made the enchanter a lazy old creature who lets the witch do all of the work. And I made Hansel and Gretel into the two most objectionable children I could, whining and quarreling and insolent and greedy. Then I made the mother and father into a pair of bewildered, helpless parents who want their children to be well-mannered and nice, but find out that nothing seems to help. They've joined the PTA and the Little League and bought Girl Scout cookies and given the children bicycles for Christmas and gone to the class play, and still their children are impolite and bad. So the witch does not want to capture the children at all, but has to shut them in her house to keep them from eating all of it. And when she tries to give the children back, the parents will not take them. The witch begs and threatens, but the parents point out that the children are so unpleasant, they would prefer to have the witch keep them. Oh, I had a wonderful time writing it, though I had half an idea that I'd better keep my play away from the children, as it outraged all the tenets of fairy tales. Every time I thought of things my children do that I can't stand, and there are a lot of them, I put them in for Hansel and Gretel. As I went along, I thought of a little song that Hansel and Gretel could sing, a kind of echo song in which one of them says, "You're mean," and the other answers, "You're mean," and it goes on, "You're bad, you're bad, you're a pig, I won't play with you, you're a pig, I won't play with you." I wrote the lyrics in, and when I'd finished the first half of my play, I thought it over and decided I would show it to the children. Well, to my surprise, they loved it. There was an immediate wild demand to be allowed to play the parts of Hansel and Gretel, and the children took up my little song and chanted it to a tune adapted from a nursery rhyme, adding verses freely and shouting it from one end of the house to the other. They began quoting lines back and forth, and then I discovered a very odd thing. I had thought of mother and father characters as sympathetic, but kind of mixed up and tired, the way I see mothers and fathers. But, however, once the children got hold of the play, the mother and father changed. They became slightly silly, and it emerged that mother and father were going to become the comedic roles. The witch and the enchanter became the powerful figures. From the enchanter's first appearance, it is perfectly obvious that he is the kind of person who would drop dead before he would umpire a little league game. And the witch's main desire is to go on a television quiz show and make a lot of money and spend it on fancy clothes and good things to eat. They are, in a word, not at all proper parent figures, and the children loved them. We ran almost at once into further complications. The children were singing that little echo song, and they thought they would like more music, particularly a song for the witch to sing. That was my older daughter, who fancied herself on stage, belting out a solo number, and another song to close the play. My son offered to write the music, and I wrote a couple of songs with simple jingling words, but it soon turned out that they did not want simple songs. So it was unanimously decided that the song the enchanter sings must be a real low-down blues, to be called the Mean Old Wizard Blues. And to begin, I want a rich witch baby, no others need apply. While I sat there with my jaw hanging, the blues got itself composed and firmly embedded in the family culture. I got in a couple of fast patter songs for the witch and the parents, with a lot of rhymes that could be from Noel Coward. And then I found that what my children wanted to close the show was a good fast number, very rhythmic with hand clapping and a chorus. I got that song written and then proposed that since the big moment in the play is the one in which the witch and the enchanter do a magic incantation, there might be a little musical number for that scene too. Thereupon, my son composed the Incantation Rock and Roll, which he said was a good wailing rock song with a boogie bass and a crazy backbeat. I was a little bit worried. Something had gone terribly wrong with my idea of making a silly little play for the kids to put on. Then I realized what it was. I had written it from my own viewpoint, hinting ironically that children ought to behave better, thinking I had a sound little moral lesson there that would really do the children good, hearing how unpleasant Hansel and Gretel sounded on the stage and how they distressed their parents. But when the children got hold of it, it turned into a general statement by the children themselves about the world. They wanted the fun of pretending to be bad children, the deep satisfaction of making fun of the parents, and the laziness and self-indulgence of the witch and the enchanter, and the excitement and spirit of modern music. I did make one attempt to rescue my play. I rewrote the ending so that by means of magic, Hansel and Gretel are transformed into sweet, dear, good, kind little kitties. But the children threw it right out. Hansel and Gretel stay horrible to the end. Above everything else, I was desperately afraid that they would try to perform the play in public. I was quite sure that we would be everlastingly disgraced if that souped-up, cynical fairy tale ever reached a real stage. I managed to get it put off till fall, because I thought the children would really have had all their fun by then. Unfortunately, they took the songs to school, then began repeating lines from the play, and inevitably, finally, I found that copies were being mimeographed and passed around the 7th grade. I wanted to take a firm stand, but before I could make up my mind what to say, I received requests from 2 local high schools for permission to put on the play. While I was still reeling, the principal of a private school 30 miles away called me to say she had heard about this play and was there any chance of their performing it. I tried to tell everyone that it was a rather callous parody, cynical, full of slang, but all the teachers said the same thing. What a wonderful idea! The children will be really interested and will actually enjoy a play that speaks their language. Well, it certainly does speak their language, much more so than that play about the fisherman's wife who fears that her wretched hut will not withstand the rigors of the winter. And now that it exists, I can't seem to get rid of it. It is a defiant statement by a pack of children about their world and their acceptance of it. I finally gave in as gracefully as I could. I had the play copyrighted, including the lyrics and music, and gave it to the children. It belongs to them. I am going to stick to ghosts and haunted houses where I belong.